Our next panel, I'm going to go ahead and read the bios for our panelists so that when everyone's seated, we can get right to it. Thanks so much, Asa. That was really beautiful. I mean, that's like an understatement, right? That was really nice, Asa. Yeah, I'm so happy again that we were able to make this happen after 5 years, pandemic, some other things. So yeah, as they're setting up, I'll be reading the bios. Our panel is the Care and Curation, Indigenous Curation of Collections, Objects, and Artists. We'll be hearing today from Sháńdíín Brown, Zach Feuer, Tess Lukey, NaDaizja Bolling. So NaDaizja Bolling is a citizen of the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head, Aquinnah, and serves as the executive director of the Aquinnah Cultural Center. She comes from the Vanderhoot family of Aquinnah, a long line of educators, traditional artists, fishers, and leaders, and carries that legacy forward each day as a traditional dancer, weaver, regalia maker, Wampanoag language learner and speaker, and community leader. Through her role at the Aquinnah Cultural Center, she helps shapes how Wampanoag history and culture are preserved, interpreted, and shared with both tribal citizens and the broader public. Her approach integrates cultural artistry, land and water memory, organizational strategy, and deep relationship building to support collective knowledge and brilliant Wampanoag futures. We'll also be hearing from Sháńdíín Brown, Dene, who is a curator, creative, and citizen of the Navajo Nation from Arizona. She's currently a PhD student in the history of art at Yale University, where she focuses on multi-temporal Native American art and fashion, with an emphasis on its connections to global Indigenous contemporary art, Indigenous feminism, and Indigenous futurism. She's curated exhibitions at the Hood Museum, Rhode Island School of Design Museum, and most recently at the Hudson River Museum. And her writing has been published in First American Art Magazine and Hyperallergic. And I should also say that Sháńdíín, along with Terry, were the interlocutors for Eric Paul and myself 2 years ago in the Half and Refer collection. So we really could not have made this show without Sháńdíín's amazing and funny commentary throughout the whole process. Zach Feuer is the director of the Gochman Family Collection, a distinguished lending collection featuring artwork by Indigenous and American artists. A co-founder of both the New Art Dealers Alliance, NADA, and Forge Project, Feuer has played a pivotal role in supporting artists and workers in the cultural sector. He previously served as director of the Sculpture Park at Art Omai, and owned and operated several commercial galleries focusing on contemporary art by early and mid-career artists, including the eponymous Zach Feuer Gallery from 2000 to 2015. And finally, last but not least, Tess Lukey, Aquinnah Wampanoag, is the Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Trustees of Reservations, where she's based at Fruitlands Museum and the DeCordova Sculpture Park and Museum. Her curatorial practice centers on the intersection of historic and contemporary Native American art, with a focus on Indigenous-led interpretation and community-driven frameworks. She holds an MA in art history with a minor in museum studies from the University of New Mexico and a dual BFA in ceramics and art history from Mass Art. Lukey's contributed to exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and curated several shows at Fruitlands, including Across Boundaries, Across Barriers, and Place of Intersection, Survivance in the American West. She also serves as an independent curator for the 2025 Boston Public Art Triennial, which is closing imminently, so get over to Boston if you can and see some of those amazing pieces all over the city. As a practicing artist, Lukey continues her Wampanoag traditions in ceramics and basketry, reflecting her commitment to cultural continuity through both institutional and creative practice. Okay, so without further ado, let's get the conversation started. Yeah. I'll start talking, but we're also going to have a little interruption because they need to stay hydrated up here. Hi, y'all. Hi. Hey, good morning. I figured since lots of folks are here and know about your practice, and then some might not, that maybe we can start with maybe just hearing a little bit from each of you, just about some highlights from your illustrious bios and other things. Whatever you'd like to share, even just in terms of thinking around maybe different curatorial practices of care that came along the way or other kinds of highlights, right? We'll keep this part brief so we can really have it be a conversation between really the four of you, with all of us just listening into some of your brain thoughts. And thanks to Christina Young, who put together all of the slides. So it's like a magic mystery. Oh, we're not seeing anything. What's happening? Oh no. Okay, so not to put you on the spot, NaDaizja, but since we were slideless.
Sure. Yeah, I'm doing the improv thing.
Yeah, you're doing the improv thing.
I think it's on.
Okay. So, hi everybody. Natasui's NaDaizja, Nutomasa Kunahana. I am NaDaizja. I am of Aquinnah, and I'm the executive director of the Aquinnah Cultural Center. I came into this work kind of by happenstance. It's interesting being considered a curator. My background is in business analytics and public health, so always centering my community's care and health and well-being. I got into the business side of things with the hope of helping Indigenous artists that were in my family and thinking about how to help propel their work into the next level. But during the COVID pandemic, I had a bit of a moment where I realized I wanted to be closer to my family. I'd been living in Washington, D.C., so I just kind of dropped everything and came home. And at that time, there was an opening for a program director at the Cultural Center. And I took those folks up on it and crafted the role into something that was more aligned with my skill set. And since then, I've been really working with my own knowledge base, my community, my colleagues, to try to grow the Cultural Center into its name. We are a small house museum, very tiny house museum at the Vanderhoop Homestead, which was built by my 3 times great-grandfather. And that is what the Aquinnah Wampanoag community has for a museum. We hold all of our belongings, or most of them, and it's our responsibility to help interpret them for the broader community. I took a big responsibility in kind of closing the curtain for a minute and focusing inward on my own community and making sure that we understood what was going on at the museum and that we were connecting with one another so that we can strengthen that base and be better interpreters of our history as a whole. So we're kind of transitioning out of that place right now and doing more public-facing work. But that's kind of how I came into this curatorial space, abstractly.
Yeah. Can I ask if you could share a little bit more about, how you all kind of maybe build collections or build up exhibitions, and maybe some of the relationships that kind of ground, right, what it is that you're presenting, whether it's exhibitions or public programs or other gatherings?
Yeah, so we've been doing some temporary exhibiting during the summertime, which is when we're open. So we have a short window, usually 4 to 6 weeks, where we're highlighting a particular exhibit. We focus first on our own artists. There are some really incredible Aquinnah Wampanoag artists. Some have been mentioned today, Elizabeth James Perry. Then there's also Donald Wittes and his entire family. I'm speaking of them because those are 2 exhibits that we featured this summer. One was called Generations, and it was looking at Donald Wittes' wampum artistry, as well as his sons, Heath and Jason Wittes, who are potters and wampum makers, and Donald Wittes' mother, Gladys Wittes, who taught her family how to use the cliff clay to make pottery that Gayhead's really well known for. So this was an exhibit that we had on loan from the Martha's Vineyard Museum, which was part of a larger relationship building effort, but really was important to bring that into our own space and interpret it a little bit differently from our perspective. The other was highlighting some of the work of Elizabeth James Perry through Seals and Society. That was an exhibit produced by the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and Elizabeth and a team of, I think, 3 other researchers and curators put that together. So we adapted it a bit, again, to focus on Elizabeth and her work, but also using the space of the House Museum where you can see right through to the ocean as a really nice anchor to talk about our relationship with seals that is lesser known.
Amazing, thank you. I think we're still working on some of the tests. Okay, yeah. If it's possible, Sháńdíín, would you mind sharing just a little bit? We'll get the slides up with all your beautiful pictures too. We're just going to keep it moving because that's what we do.
Hi everyone. Yat Haley Sháńdíín Brownie-nishya. Kia ani nishle bilagana bashichin tltlana dashiche do bilagana dashanele. Ak ego dene et anishle beshage det a isi nasha do kanerik ha hotso deshigan nadin id shinahai do Mesa, Arizona shidish. So, hi everyone. I just introduced myself in NaDaizja. I'm sure Haven and Eric Paul could understand what I was saying. I was at Dene College this past summer doing Navajo language classes, so my forever homework is to do my introduction. I just said in NaDaizja or Navajo language, my name is Sháńdíín. I'm 27. I was born and raised in Arizona, and now I live in Connecticut, and I'm a PhD student at Yale. And thank you, everyone, for coming. It's so exciting to see all of my friends. Oh my God, I'm gonna get emotional because I used to work at the Rhode Island School of Design, I think from 22 to 26 or maybe 25. So it was a lot of fun. So thank you guys for coming. And also it's super exciting to be on this panel. I've been friends with these guys for years now. And I'm just really excited to celebrate you, Eric Paul. And the show is a really major achievement and it's beautiful. So super excited about that. I guess what I do as a curator, I've done different shows. I work with historic Indigenous art and also contemporary Indigenous art. My most recent show was over 20 contemporary Indigenous artists. Eric Paul was one of them. And I'm thinking a lot about curating exhibitions as almost like writing essays. So if you're curious how that connects to being an academic, thinking about exploring different topics of Indigenous art to different audiences. When I worked at RISD, that was really cool because we had the Brown community and also, all the crazy art students at RISD to kind of talk about these new and different topics with. Okay, so what we're looking at the screen right now is a show that I did at the RISD Museum from 2023 to 2024. And my colleague and friend, Terry, I'm gonna embarrass you. Terry from the Hafen Reffer Museum of Anthropology helped me with this show. So did my brother, Chris Brown. He's a Dene weaver. And so did my friend, Ty Matiba, who's a Dene PhD student in the math department at Columbia University. But he is fluent in NaDaizja. So for some of the weaving terms, I really wanted to make sure we had them in NaDaizja. What we're looking at on the screen is pieces from the late 1800s that are in RISD Museum's collection. And then there's also contemporary pieces. Like I think that Tanaba Natani piece, yeah, the one you're looking at all the way to the left, that was an acquisition for the RISD Museum and was made in, I think, 2023. So we were doing a, like over 150 year span of Dene textiles. And this was kind of like a passion project for me. I come from a family of weavers, and Eric Paul and I both do. And it's just something that I grew up with and then being able to work in museum collections where they have these like amazing, masterpieces was really fun. So yeah, I could talk about this, Thea, so much, but I think we're just doing the highlights. And I guess a highlight of the show was kind of thinking about how Dene textiles, the ones that you're looking at on the mannequins, a lot of those were displayed before at the RISD Museum against the wall as like a painting. So my kind of like intervention was thinking about how Dene textiles are not only art pieces or pieces to be hung, but they're also fashion and wearables, and kind of how in Dene Bazad or Navajo language, we don't have a word for art. And so how do those like boundaries within the canon of art history and Western art history maybe flatten Indigenous ways of thinking about objects or works. I guess that would be what I would say instead of art pieces. And speaking of Indigenous fashion, I also want to say the hat I'm wearing, Eric Paul's mom made. Yeah.
Aretha original. Do you want me to?
Oh yeah, this is I was talking about the group show we did at the Hudson River Museum that was on view this year, and it closed in August. And I picked this install shot just because you can see Eric Paul's piece. So if you guys go to the Bell, you'll see that piece now living his new life here in Providence, from Gallup to Rhode Island. And the other works you're looking at are from Peter Jemison. And when I was a curator at the RISD Museum, we acquired one of Peter's paintings for the permanent collection. And also you're looking at a photograph by Dakota Mays from the Forge Projects collection. And if you guys, I'm sure maybe Zach will talk about this a little bit more, but if you want to keep up to date with Indigenous contemporary art and culture, I really advise following the Forge Project. I did a writing residency with them when I worked at the RISD Museum, and it really opened my eyes to new models and new ways of thinking. But this show was big. This is just one install shot, but we can talk so much later.
Awesome. Thank you, Sháńdíín. Okay, Tess, and if you want to just tell me when to forward the slide, that might be easiest, so I'm not cutting off any images.
Sure. Mine's on, okay. NaDaizja Tess Lukey, no Thomas Aquinnah. Hi, my name is Tess Lukey. I'm a Aquinnah Wampanoag, and as Thea mentioned, I'm the Associate Curator of Native American Art for the Trustees of Reservations. I'm also the curator for the Boston Public Art Triennial, so I wear a lot of hats most days, and I do quite a few jobs around the state. You asked us about our kind of how we got into curatorial work. My parents would say I was a curator since I was a little kid. Used to curate my desk, used to curate our house, writing labels for things on my own walls. So I've been doing it since I was really little. I've also been an artist since I was little, so, it wasn't just writing, it was drawing. And all of that plays into what I do now as a curator. I've worked for several museums across the United States. I had the pleasure of connecting with Eric Paul when I was in grad school down at UNM. Some really amazing work at the beginning of your kind of career and BFA, and so really proud to be able to say I knew you when. And I was curating while I was there too. I worked for the John Summers Gallery. I've worked for anthropology museums. I've worked for a kind of encyclopedic big box art museums. And now I work for a land conservation organization. And it is wonderful and amazing, and my job changes daily. As a curator for an art museum embedded within a land con organization, I have a very interesting perspective and way of working that I get to do. I'm not only working with art, but I'm working with the community and people and the landscape. And I think all of that really plays into the work that I do inside gallery spaces as well as a public art curator. And it has influenced where I'm going in the future in terms of my curatorial practice and how I think about spaces and connection with my own people and other people's communities, and how art has this wonderful way of being able to kind of suss out and talk about really tough issues, but also shine some light on what's missing and where we can go from here. So what you're seeing up here is one of the exhibitions I mounted recently called Across Boundaries, Across Barriers at Fruitlands Museum. And it's looking at the historic collection of Native American art that was collected largely in the 1930s. 1920s and 30s by a woman named Clara Sears. She was an interesting person in terms of how she thought curatorially, and so it's been a really wonderful treat to be able to share this work in a way that grounds us in actual Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking, and Indigenous frameworks. So looking really critically at what stories are told, how they're told, and who's telling them. And so it's not just about putting together works in a gallery, but really thinking about how labels and how presentation can tell a story. And so this was a labor of love, not just from me, but also from the community across Turtle Island. Many labels were written by community curators and knowledge keepers from across the United States telling stories about their own communities rather than me being the one deciding what's being shared. There are other things like really important use of language, changing the names of objects that have been inaccurately labeled, changing the names of communities that have been inaccurately labeled, and really grounding us in place and people and today. So that's just one small exhibition centered around actually the 7 directions, really again surrounding us in our own ways of knowing, and really importantly also foregrounding us in the place that we are here, in my own community, in Massachusetts, in New England, and thinking about that as a really critical counterpoint to the way that this collection had been shown previously. And then the other exhibition, both of these are, the last one's up for 5 years. It's been up for about 2 now. It changes each year. This one will be coming down November 1, but it's called Place of Intersections, Survivance in the American West. Clara Sears had a very big fascination with the West and westward expansion, manifest destiny, all of those kinds of really hurtful but critical points in history for teaching and learning from, and in kind of in honor of her interests and also in honor of the communities that are represented in those spaces, I wanted to challenge the way that this museum has presented this history in the past, in particular really bringing together the collection as a whole, not just the Native art collection, but the Hudson River Painting School, which is also what Fruitlands is known for, and thinking about the way that artists, especially many that were working in the 19th century, were inventing our landscapes through paintings. And so many of the works that are on the walls in there are just, they're fantastical images. They never actually existed. Many of these artists never went west, but they had this way of sharing with the public and changing our views of what the public thinks of what the West looks like when it was quote unquote won, next to objects that were made by community members at the same time that you would have actually encountered, that you would have seen, or maybe caught a glimpse of if you had moved west. Another really important point about this gallery too was bringing the people back into it. So many communities are disassociated with their works that it's really important to me that that human aspect is still very much a part of the space and is actually at the forefront of it. And so bringing in imagery of actual Native people from that time in those communities was really important, which is why there's portraiture, which is why there are some older lithographs, and then of course one, it's not in that picture, contemporary intervention. And then the other point that I want to make about the work that I do is that it's not about me, it's about so much more than me and bigger than me. And part of that is collections care practice and knowing that these works, these belongings, many of them are living. And so in order to continue to care for those objects like we do our communities, it's important to feed it's important to offer them things that they need for long-term care. And so available in this space for Native visitors and Native community members are the 4 secret herbs. So we've got sage, sweetgrass, tobacco, and cedar available for the community to be able to care for their objects as they come into this space, for me to be able to care for these objects as people come into this space in a way that feels more meaningful and more impactful, because they can't be returned home until the time comes that the communities can take them. But I can get into that later. So, yeah, I think I've talked for far too long now.
No, not long enough. But okay. Thank you, Tess.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zach Feuer. I'm the director of the Gochman Family Collection. Oh, can you hear that? Let's see. I'm Zach Feuer. I'm the director of the Gochman Family Collection. I am settler from New Jersey, first generation. Before the Gochman Family Collection, I was involved in the founding Forge project, which I'm only going to talk about really briefly, and then we're going to get to the Gochman Family Collection. But you'll see up here is a building by Ai Weiwei that was purchased by Becky Gochman about 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And Becky was really inspired by Ai Weiwei's use of art to advance it's sort of like a basis for social activism, and wanted to use this building as a calling card for her philanthropy, and more so, hopefully, institutional shifts in the way that philanthropy and social justice intertwined. She cold called me. I was working at a sculpture park. I was working on a Jeffrey Gibson show at the time, and she read some article about me where I have some like nonsense white guy leftist quotes, and she was like, come advise on the starting of this project, which was like, okay, this is too amazing to pass up. So I agreed to work with her for about a year. And at the time this was happening, a lot of these sort of colonial nonprofit industrial complex systems were starting to do land acknowledgement statements. And we were starting to get into this, we were starting to read it, and it felt like a little bit silly, like that we would be like still being colonizers and like patting ourselves on the back in this weird sort of virtue signaling kind of way, and be like, all right, we're putting the vinyl up on the wall, we're good now. And we were like, well, there's got to be a systemic change. And the way that we really started thinking about that happening was focusing a structure on Indigenous leadership. And that's how this sort of the idea of Forge Project was born. So we came up with that concept. Me and Becky had a timeline to get out. Mine was a year. And Becky's took a little bit longer because she was the funder and I was the sort of like scaffold builder. This is Forge Project here. This is what happened. I'm not going to speak too much in Forge because I'm not involved with Forge anymore, and I don't speak for Forge because I'm a settler. And so Forge is run by Candace Hopkins and this amazing team, and they have a fellowship where you get $25,000 unrestricted. You get 3 weeks there. They do all this public programming. They have a lending collection. They have a journal. They produce exhibitions in collaboration with other organizations, and they're just an incredible organization. You should all follow it, and I'm not going to speak more about Forge. But so what happened at the end of that timing there at Forge was Becky and me were like, we fell really deeply in love with a lot of the artwork that we were engaged with during Forge. And we didn't want to stop working, or Becky didn't want to stop working with it. And we formed the Gochman Family Collection. And the Gochman Family Collection is not Indigenous-led. It's a settler-led organization, and it is a private collection that is structured under the typical sort of rules of capitalism in art collecting. And we acquire artworks, and then we lend them out, and we work to really act as a bridge between the sort of, I hate saying this, the contemporary art world and the native art world, and they're two separate things still, and it's a weird sort of dichotomy that exists. And so we work, my background is in the contemporary art side of things, and so we work with artists in a bunch of different ways to support their careers, to promote their work, and then at the same time educate settler institutions and provide bridges and gaps for their institutions. And this is currently where we're loaning works for. Okay, we have this website. Sorry. I mostly wanted to go over how easy it was to get art from us and how easy it is to access art. So you go to this website, you can see it's like a library. You can search for what you're looking for and a bunch of different things. And we'll get into the details of how to borrow this art later, but you can visit the work. We can go to the next slide. You can visit the work all over the world. You can see where you are based on this map and go see local works, or you can go to the next slide, or you can come visit us in Palm Beach or New York City or Hudson, New York, and visit work. We can pull works out for curators. Artists are always welcome to come visit the works. Artists sort of have first access and first choice, and we really prioritize artist organized show and native-led shows on our loans. We'll go to the next slide. This is New York City. You guys should all come visit New York City. It's amazing. This is her gym. She's very generous in letting people just come into her houses and walk around her bathrooms and look in every corner and see all this contemporary art. And so we do 3 or 4 tours a week there, in addition to having the artist visits. And it's just, you sort of have to just come see it. Let's go to the next slide. This is, one of the bigger museum groups. For a while, we were doing a lot of museum groups. Now it's been shifting a little bit more educationally. Let's go to the next slide. This is one of my favorite pieces. James Luna, take a picture with a real Indian. You can come take your selfie with James Luna.
That's the dean of the Yale Native American Cultural Center.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Let's go to the next slide. This is just an artist talk. That's me. That's my favorite artist, Mary Lou Schultz. We go to the next slide. We also have artists coming and visiting their works, and we work really hard to incorporate the language that the artists are most comfortable with around the work. A lot of times, artwork labels and texts are written without consultation for artists. I don't know why, but it happens when artists have the best information about their own work. So these are 2 artists visiting, and then almost done. This is how you borrow art from us. So you email collection@gotch.com, and you tell us what works you're interested in, and you can do this before you have the checklist for your exhibition, and we can reserve works for you. We can talk about the logistics of those pieces and timing and do conflicts. We don't charge a loan fee, and we can process loans in 2 or 3 weeks, so we're extremely fast at getting artwork out. We have a full-time registrar, unlike a lot of other collections, and we really prioritize just being really easy to work with for museums. The only thing that's a little different for borrowing us is we do require that your organization follows wage guidelines. If anyone doesn't know about wage, it's basically a system that requires artist fees based on the operating budget of the museum. I put wage up there so you can calculate how much you need to pay your artists, and everyone should be paying their artists, and that's the very quick version. And if you email me I'll send you that form, and that gives you just the list on how to borrow art. So, and that's the real fast version. So, yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for the quickest
Yeah.
rundown. I'm going to go sit down now, and maybe we can have a more organic conversation. Is it okay if I leave this slide up with Cheryl Rondell and Nicholas Galonin and Jeffrey's work? I'm doing it anyway. Okay, I'm digesting. There's so much that all of you have offered in terms of sharing your own practice. In all of the cases, I think, how you came to working in your particular institutions or working as curators in general. And one thing, when I was first kind of thinking about this whole convening / applying for funding, if you're doing a convening on American art in any way, apply to Terra, they're great. I framed this particular conversation around with curators as one thinking about shifting not just collecting practices of objects and artworks from deceased artists, but also in terms of building new collections or new presentations or new public programs or ways of interpreting, showing, engaging with contemporary Indigenous artworks and artists. And given that all of you are working in very different contexts, from house museums to land grant or conservancy spaces to lending collections to independent work across multiple kinds of spaces and institutions, I'd really love to know maybe some practices or tips or stories that all of you might have around facilitating, right, or transforming institutions in small ways or ephemeral ways to some of the work that you've been doing really specifically, right, to challenging interpretation. I know some of you have talked a bit about that, even in terms of how you write labels or how you have community consultation. But if you could each expound a little bit more on that, I'm sure people would love to hear how, curators make change at very different scales or are limited sometimes by the particular institutions and, have to be creative in strategies.
I have a story I can share.
Yeah.
It's a story of changing my mind too. Actually, it's not just about changing the mind of the institution that I work for, but changing what I had as a kind of preconceived notion about something. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Fruitlands Museum in Harvard. Has a long and storied past. One of the things it's known for and has been become synonymous with, in fact, it at one point was the almost like icon or symbol for the museum is 2 statues that are outside of what was formerly known as the Native American Museum. I've changed that since I was there, just so y'all know. And one is titled Pamagawesset, which is supposed to be a statue of a Narragansett man. It's called He Who Shoots the Stars. He's shooting a bow towards the sky. Completely inaccurate statue. That story doesn't exist. The other one is of a man that's sitting kind of crouched on a piece of stone. He's got a feathered headdress on, and he kind of looks off in the distance because Fruitlands is at this beautiful viewpoint. You can really see all around for quite a few miles. And that statue for me was always a problem because it is one of those representations of Native people in spaces in New England that doesn't have any connection to the community itself here. And I had thought for a very long time, the same way that Cyrus Dahlin's piece outside of the MFA is inaccurate, I thought this was inaccurate. I was like, this, I don't really want this as our representation for Native people here. We need something new, we need something contemporary, we need something made by a maker here, or someone who's willing to work with the community. And then I got an email from someone at the Springfield College who was touring with the family of Luis Gonzalez Wopin from San Ildefonso Pueblo. For those who haven't been to Springfield College, they have some murals that were done by this artist and former chief of the Pueblo. Really incredible Kiva murals. And so he was here visiting those, but he knew that there was a statue that is titled The Dreamer, and that's the statue that I couldn't stand, that I thought was inaccurate, and he wanted to come see it because supposedly it was his dad. It was representative of his dad. And so I said, okay, come on down. I'm happy to bring you here. I'm happy to host you. We have a couple other works by him in our collection, so I was pulling photos and things like that to share with them while they were here. He had maybe 30 minutes. These people were on their way. He and his son were on their way to the airport. They had very little time to come and see this work. But I said, I'm still happy to bring you. So they show up and in true fashion are getting out of the car and giving me big hugs, and it felt so much like home. It was just, instantly I knew it was going to be an okay experience regardless of whether this was true or not. But we're walking over to the statue, and Ed and Thomas, Ed is Wopin's son, and Thomas is his grandson. We're walking over the statue, and Ed is in tears. And I was like, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know why. He hadn't seen his dad in over 30 years. He had passed. And it was so accurate that it was like walking up to his father. And see, it makes me teary too. He stands up to the statue and he puts his hand on the foot that's kind of dangling off the stone. He goes, "Hi, Dad." And I just lost it. And it occurred to me that this moment, this was true. This statue was no longer inaccurate to me. It was what his dad looked like. He showed me pictures of his regalia. It was 100% true to how he represented himself as a Native man, both in kind of traditional formats and also to the public. And so I had to completely change my perspective and the museum's perspective on this piece, because no longer was it inaccurate, no longer did it misrepresent Native people, but in truth, it's his dad. And so now I've had the chance to build a relationship with that family and change the label. And I have a continued relationship through email and pictures and phone calls and time spent eating peaches in his family home from his family orchard. I have these wonderful memories tied to it, and I get to share that with the public. And it's something that he and I have been working on, trying to craft a new label and maybe potentially some sort of listening format, QR code label for it, for them to hear the stories about his dad, because this statue has been so long misunderstood. And was a moment for me changing my perspective and now changing the public's perspective on representation that's accurate and true. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the I have no story as amazing as that. One of the continual problems that we're running into, that we're seeing a shift in sort of curatorial work here, is that because we are sort of a bridge organization, the educational requirements of a lot of our visitors lead to some really awkward experiences where they come to us expecting an identity-based collection, and they want an identity-based collection to fix their representational problem as opposed to engage directly with artwork. And it is a consistent curatorial challenge. It's gotten better over the years to have people who just want to have better stats after George Floyd actually look at real art, and I think we're getting there step by step. But it is sort of our biggest challenge in the sort of segregation of these art worlds is that, and I'm seeing I think it's happening a lot, a big shift. Maybe you guys can speak more to that shift, but I would say that's sort of our biggest challenge, and the best thing a curator can come in and to our space is to be looking at individual artists. Obviously, everyone here is doing that already, but it's really a very broad sort of search for pan-indigeneity that makes people blind, and it gets exhausting. So yeah.
Can I ask, actually? Because I know that we have some folks, Rachel Martin and Sháńdíín in particular, who also work with the Gochman family collection. If there's any work that you undertake, Zach, or in combination with Sháńdíín and Rachel or some of the other Native curators and artists to kind of help with that re-education before you lend out or after you lend out the pieces.
Sháńdíín, why don't you talk about George Morrison?
Oh boy, what about the Morrison?
The projections on whiteness and George Morrison?
Yeah, so I think this is such a hard question, and definitely, no, it's okay. I'm happy to have this conversation here. I think part of the work, I suppose, in the contemporary art space that we think a lot about is what Zach is talking about. Is it Native artists or is it artists who happen to be Native? And so my position at the RISD Museum was I was a curatorial fellow for Native American art, and then I was assistant curator of Native American art. So it's clearly defined by identity, but if you go to the RISD Museum and the galleries, there is no Native American art gallery. And I'm also not exactly arguing for that. My old supervisors are here, so they've had to hear me go back and forth because I think, Native artists do deserve to have space in the galleries, but I'm not exactly sure in what way. And so for George Morrison, there was a piece by him in the show that I did on the second side, Smoke in Our Hair, at the Hudson River Museum. We had a whole program that was dedicated to George Morrison's legacy. If you're not sure or aware of George Morrison's work, Google him. He actually used to teach at the Rhode Island School of Design for about a decade. And he was a major player in the abstract painting movement in New York. And a lot of his abstract buddies, I'm not totally sure, understood him as the Native guy, but more just as George. And George Morrison also made a clear, and we know this in the scholarship, a really clear statement not to reference any definitive imagery of nativeness in his work. The piece that, it's a masterpiece. I wish I had a photo of it, but that's up for our viewers to go research the show. The Morrison piece that we had up did take some intervention and programming. And it was also very stressful to write that label, Zach knows, because I wanted to make sure the public was understanding the high level of painting technique that was going into the work, and also who he was and the legacy he had, not only in the abstract movement, but also at RISD. He mentored so many students who became fabulous artists. And he also dedicated and had concerted energy towards Native students like Andrea Carlson. So in Smoke in Our Hair, they're from the same tribe, Grand Portage Ojibwe. So in Smoke in Our Hair, you'll see that their works are actually displayed in conversation with one another to kind of show this generation movement that flows between artists. And then so for that program for Smoke in Our Hair, we recorded it, and I think you can watch it on YouTube, but we had Anya Montiel, who is Tana Atam, and she's a curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indian, and she actually worked on George Morrison's large exhibition about 20 years ago at the NMAI. And then we also had Steve Scott Manning, I think I'm getting his name a little confused, but he's a Haudenosaunee art historian at Syracuse University. And so they both kind of gave their scholarly interpretations of George Morrison's work. It was great because my Yale professors came, and then now hopefully we've convinced them to add George Morrison into their curriculum at Yale. So the classes at Yale aren't just specifically Native art classes, but they're a broad art history, digestive, lens. So is that what you're thinking of?
Totally. I was more thinking about that like saying of like, not pretty enough for LA, not smart enough for New York, where it's like, you're like, and it becomes like this sort of, endless dichotomy of like how, if someone's Native enough for this show, but not Native enough for that, and there's these sort of like, artists in the middle that are really like the funny floating thing. Like George Morrison is an abstract expressionist, and instead of being in the modern galleries at the Met right now, his survey is in the Native section. And there's these like funny, weird things that are still happening because of these projections of limits of indigeneity in contemporary art spaces. Yeah, you totally covered that also.
I feel like that's something a lot of institutions are fighting, like trying to figure out what's American, what's Native American, what's where that line is, how you show it, how you describe it. When I was working for PEM as a fellow, like we were going through that idea of trying to figure out what to name the gallery space because none of us felt comfortable with it being American or Native American, which is why it ended up with a slash because we couldn't come up with something that felt genuine. In a way that actually like got it, and I think we'll get there maybe, I don't know. That's why I changed the name of the gallery at Fruitlands, because it's not a Native American museum. Our people are still alive, these people are still alive, these beings are still alive, these objects are still alive. So it felt so much like it was entrenching it in the past, and I'm sure you guys are dealing with the same issues, even at the Aquinnah Cultural Center.
Yeah, and to speak to that a little bit, at the Cultural Center, as I mentioned before, we are a small house museum, and I can't tell you how many times people come in and they're asking if this is where Wampanoags live. Like they're a little confused that we have lived in these kind of colonial homes for generations, and so we take it as an opportunity to explain and share our history through the random home artifacts that you might see because they belong to this particular family who has this really strong relationship with fishing, or this family who, that was our chief, and this is where this belonging came from. So we deal with that all the time. And we're also trying to make room for more contemporary living artists too. And it's a struggle. We're in a home built in the late 1800s. And so that contrast can be pretty stark sometimes. And so more recently, we've been highlighting artists who are in more traditional Wampanoag art forms, but not limiting it to that. So we have spaces like our gift shop, and we have lots of events that come out of the cultural center that uplift Wampanoag artists in ways that we can't make space for all the time in our very small house museum.
And I think about that too in relation to what the Tamaqua Museum is also doing down in Charleston. Silver Moon LaRose was not able to join our panel today, sadly, to speak about the work that they're doing themselves. But I do encourage folks to please check them out. And they are in the process of fundraising now for a major expansion, actually on the grounds of the URI campus in Kingston. So please do see what they're doing and cooking up down there. I know they just celebrated their cranberry Thanksgiving, so they're really, really active and doing amazing work as well. Before we open it up, I think, to audience questions, 'cause I'm sure, especially my students, have questions for you all. Yeah, it's just about me goading and pressuring people to say things all the time. You would, I mean, you've already done this, I think all of you in different ways. If there's maybe a particular story of either a particular object or artwork that you feel like you've really had to care for, and I'll use that really expansively, in a particular way, and for a longer duration perhaps than just one exhibition. Right? Either by bringing it into a collection, again, shifting interpretation by educating the folks who do own the piece, if it's a museum or private lender, or yeah, something like that, right? I'll just share, and this is a really important kind of origin story, I would say, for Eric Paul's exhibition, is that, you know, when Sháńdíín and Terry were showing us the collections in the Hafenreffer in Bristol, there was a sample loom, right, a very small loom, in their collection. And, you know, these were made as forms of display, right, for settler trading posts, sometimes in the absence of, or sometimes in addition to, right, your live display of a real Navajo Indian at the loom, right, to show people that what they were buying was authentic. And so in this sample loom, when they unrolled it, there was still the comb and the baton inside of it. And as Eric Paul and Sháńdíín very kind of quickly told us and noticed right away, is that by leaving those tools in there, that the loom was essentially, and the weaving was essentially awake. And Eric Paul talks about this as, you know, seeing something that's been buried alive, because these tools should be removed when they're not actively in use. And so that was seeing the broken comb, taking it out, was the inspiration, I think, for a lot of the show's kind of beginnings. And it's really important, right, to know that now Terry and Kelly and their team have that in the notes, right? It's not officially a NAGPRA item since it's not an ancestor or ceremonial, but it's officially there that these objects in general, right, should not be stored in this way. And so hopefully moving forward, right, all of their weavings across different collections will be, right, allowed to rest. So I think that is maybe just one example, right, of an artist with a deep connection to this history and tradition coming in and, yeah, hopefully shifting the museum's practice for perpetuity. So yeah, any examples, anything you want to share?
So for Becky Gochman's been really radical in her collecting, and I think that there's a quote by Chinooka about how culture happens at the time the artwork is made, not when the remnant of the object enters the museum later. And so we're really not object focused in a lot of ways. And she's collected performances, she's collected a piece that is going to lose weight every time it's exhibited. That belongs to Forge now, where the beads just disperse and eventually it'll be gone. That piece on the back there is made out of tobacco and pantyhose. If it lasts for 10 years, it's going to be amazing. And that's been like a really amazing sort of growth experience to see a collector learn how to deal with that. I think one of the challenging pieces that she acquired, which we ended up deciding that shouldn't be in the collection, that she donated it for, was by Nicholas Galliman, and it was handcuffs that were made for potentially a child in a residential school. And he had designed it as an art object, decided it should go to an art fair, decided it should enter like this settler contemporary art space, and we engaged with it in that way because, like, well, if the artist decided that's where it goes, it goes. And she acquired the work because it was a powerful work, and then as soon as she sat with it, she sort of was like, this does not belong in a settler collection. This does not belong in here. This is contemporary art, but it needs to exist in a different kind of space. And so that was donated to Forge, I don't know, a couple years ago as well. And that was a really challenging thing where her decision for the work was a little bit different than the artist's, thinking about sort of the historical material that he was using as content. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I'd say for me, there's a really wonderful Aquinnah Wampanoag traditional artist, Julia Martin, who is really well known for her weaving in particular. And she recently completed a fully closed twined turkey feather mantle. And it's the first done in that style, and we believe at least 400 years in that particular technique. And when she completed this garment 2 years ago, it was really important for her to first let our community have the opportunity to wear it. The style of the garment was something that was traditionally reserved for somebody who had more resources and time to complete something of that scale. And she wanted us all to feel connected to it. So she held events first in Aquinnah at the Cultural Center, was where she debuted it and invited a small group of community to come and have a photo shoot with it. And then she took the mantle to our sister communities in Mashpee, in Herring Pond, Osonet, and let those folks interact with the garment as well. And then the following year, before she, I forget where it's on loan right now for a couple of years, but before that, she let the Aquinnah Cultural Center really debut it in an exhibition. And that was really special and scary. There was so much to do about this piece, and the idea of having it in our very old home was very nerve-wracking. And so we really leaned into our partnerships with larger institutions to figure out how to properly care for and display this piece in a way that didn't really box it off from that intent of having a close look. So we had to make sure that we could fully walk around the piece and people could see the inside and the outside of it. And those are all really careful considerations that we made, but it was strange having a huge display case in a small home with only 7.5 foot ceiling clearance. We had to break the case a little bit. We had to bend the brackets on the side to even get it to fit in the home. So that was a huge effort, something we're really proud of, but a challenge. And it was really special for me because Julia is my teacher. That's who has taught me over the years, and I've spent lots of time traveling up to where she lives in Vermont just to learn from her. And so even transporting the garment, that was me driving out to visit with Julia and having the opportunity to just sit with her before taking it to its home to be displayed for the first time.
Wow, thank you.
I don't know that it's a particular object. I mean, I mentioned that we have medicine in the gallery for Native people. We're all going through new regs related to NAGPRA, and it's really important that institutions continue to uphold that, not just to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of the law. And so many of the works that are in the collection that I steward, I send them all home. My team is very much in the same kind of space in terms of thinking about who those objects belong with, who they're intended to be with for their lives, and how certain objects don't need to be preserved in the same way that museums like to preserve them over time, and thinking about the life of those belongings and those works as something that's known by the community, not by us. And they are the appropriate ones to care for and understand those works. And so, in the meantime, I'm the person that gets to take care of and steward them until they return home. So we have some objects that long should have been returned and needed to be fed with tobacco. Recently we had a community member come in and they were like, you really need to put some tobacco with these because they've been known to burn down museums. And so and so in their proper housing, they have tobacco to feed them now. And they were put to sleep in the interim. And so I know that there are instances across museums that are doing things like that. But in truth, the care is also tied to the return. So it's not even just about long-term collections care or collections care policies in museums. It's about putting the community forward and letting them decide, not us. as an institution.
Yay. Thank you for sharing that. Sháńdíín, did you want to share something?
Sure. I think I'm going to flex my multi-temporal aspect and talk about the care of historic items. So I think a lot about curatorial consent, like when Tess is talking about returning things, like were historic Native American art objects in this museum collection meant for sale? Did the artists willingly and with consent say, I want this to be in the art market, and then it can go live wherever it wants to live? So I think like when we're taking care of and stewarding historic Indigenous objects, I think about curatorial consent. I also think about the behind the scenes care that doesn't get you accolades or applause, that I think a lot of the curators sitting in this audience know about. And that means I've done work with NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So when we think about doing NAGPRA work, we think about trust with the people we're working with, relationship building, which is more than hi, bye, see you later. That really means, and it really has to come from the higher ups and institutions committing to have these relationships, and also transparency. So that means being honest and also not over promising. And I think that also means institutions being honest with themselves about if they have the money and time to take care of these historic collections in in museums, or if they're just going to sit there and, for better or worse, excuse me being crude, but rot. They do need to be, my personal opinion is that yes, they do need to be interacted with. And so thinking about collection care for NAGPRA objects is really, really important. Also knowing the right people to even understand what a NAGPRA object is. Not all historic Native American art is meant for repatriation. I think that's something that when I was a 19-year-old interning at a big encyclopedic museum, I didn't understand. And it is very confusing sometimes to understand that, but that's when you build relationships with experts. Not everyone is an expert on over 574 tribes in the US. So that means we have to build relationships with our colleagues and help each other. And I also think that in the way of thinking about transparency is also for our Dene Textiles show at the RISD Museum. So my tribe is Dene. So we're based in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. So obviously I was aware that my audience wasn't going to be Dene viewers. But we did collections visits leading up to the exhibition with different Navajo people who would roll through on campus. And I think not even just having care for these historic textiles, but also for the people who were viewing them. Some of the Dene elders did get extremely emotional seeing these textiles, not that they were NAGPRA objects, right? Not that they were meant to be repatriated, but I do think we are in a Native cultural renaissance where a lot of our elders had their identity, their art practices, and their languages taken away from them. So museums, one of the best things we can do as curators is to kind of draw that link and maybe help some of that really destructive history that's happened in people's lives who are living today. This isn't just some far away trauma, it's very much so living. So as a curator, that also means having an open heart and the space to receive when people are upset, looking at historic items. And we had a textile in the Dene Textile show that we nicknamed Beyonce because a group of Dene weavers, it was Kevin Aspes, Tyrell Tapaha, Barbara Teller Ornelas, and Linda Teller Pete thought this was the most amazing Navajo women's manta they had seen. And it lives at RISD. So just sending them pictures, and then Barbara and Linda got to come to our collections and spend time with that textile, letting them touch it. We even let Barbara try on some of the textiles because they are fashion pieces. So it's kind of having that flexibility. And also I was really lucky, and I think this kind of works in with what I'm saying about relationship building in NAGPRA. I was really lucky at the RISD Museum that I had good relationships with my colleagues, and they were willing to think outside of the typical museum box. So I think we would always say, just because we've always done something some way doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way. And that's kind of hard to also balance with doing contemporary art, but I think that kind of draws us back into like, what is the job of a curator? And yeah, Beyonce, I would always point out in tours, I'd be like, you guys, look at this gold you're looking at right now. And I think the textile students got it, but also just putting that in the interpretation of the label to really let people know that it was a special piece.
Thank you. Any questions from folks? You might have to project, and I can also repeat what I hear if we don't have a traveling mic. Yeah, is that you, Kiku?
Yes.
Hi. Okay, glasses on.
Just since we're talking about fashion, I had a question about like all the beautiful adornments that I see you wearing, and how you think about when you bring out different pieces by different artists in different contexts, and how you kind of like curate your outfits, and how you care for jewelry that you might have that was made by Native artists. Specifically, I'm asking because I recently bought something and it broke, and I'm not sure, like, do I go back to the artist who made it and ask her to fix it, or do I try to do it myself?
I love wearing black, mostly.
Curator uniform.
But I always do wear a little bit of wampum, and that feels very authentic to me. I switch around the studs, but I always have a pair of wampum studs on, and they're in my rings. And then I think that I consider my markings part of my adornment and my outfits. And so they're all traditional hand poke tattoos. And then these earrings are made by Tiffany Vanderhoop, Huckleberry Woman. She is a Aquinnah Wampanoag and Haida artist, and my first cousin. So I love to wear my family's work. As far as care, I have a massive earring collection. I've recently started keeping things in plastic though, especially when they're metals, because where I live there's a lot of salt air, and it's just been kind of ruining my jewelry.
I would echo the wearing my family's jewelry. I am also doing that. I'm wearing Elizabeth James Perry's work, both on my necklace and ears, and I think this is Jason Wittes, and then there's a couple other people on me, but works on what I'm wearing right now. But I'm always wearing wampum too. I think it's really important that I'm constantly sharing out my Aquinnah identity and connection to that space as a part of how I outwardly share my identity and what I wear each day. As far as wampum care, I treat it like all the rest of my giant earring collection too. I keep it in safe spaces, and when it needs, these are traditionally polished, so I tend to oil them sometimes when they get dusty looking. But other than that, I mean, it's just a matter of relationship with the material itself, and knowing that it's living too. So
Yes, I say go back to the artist and ask for repair. I think when we're talking about like what Zach was talking about Gabrielle's piece that is made to, or it will disintegrate, like working with organic and natural materials that isn't acrylic or plastic, they will break, and that's just a natural life cycle. I don't know, I wonder if it was the earrings I made you. Okay, I was like, because I'll right now give it to me. But yeah, I mean, I think like Native fashion as curators is so important because like our grandparents' generation at boarding school weren't allowed to wear their regalia, and we are both makers, and I think we both sell to Native and non-Native audiences. So, you know, for us, we're happy to see people wear work who aren't just a part of our community. I'm really bad because I study Native fashion, so I think I need a registrar for my own closet.
You do. You do.
Yeah, and just thinking about the ways like fashion is so political. Read my dissertation in 5 years, but it is really important to have things on our body represent who we are, our family, and where we come from.
I'll just say really quickly, similarly to some of you, most of my tattoos on my arms were made by other queer femme Filipinx artists in San Francisco, or in Seattle as well, which represent like various creation myths and queering of those things. So I like having lineage like inked onto my body, but not necessarily appropriating indigenous bands, which a lot of Filipinx American folks do, even if they're not tied to those specific communities in the Philippines, so don't do that. Just because we're brown, we're not all indigenous in the same way. We can be settlers too. And then these earrings, now that Raquel Gutierrez is in the room, you know the maker of this, and they were a poet who taught with you at IIA. Esther Billen? Okay. Yes, and I wanted to shout her out because I kept these in the box for 2 years to wear them at Eric Paul's opening, because when I saw them, I was like, they look like a pair of his earrings. So they finally came out, and this is their second wearing, and it felt like a nice time for them to be in the world, to hang out with Eric Paul's earrings for the big gods.
Oh, I guess I should say my earrings. Like, let's do that.
Yeah.
These are by Chambry Wensalt, who's a Dene artist, and they say land back. So as you think about
Yes.
Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday,
That's right.
yeah.
One more question, if anyone wants to give, and we can also, have more informal conversations as the day goes. If folks want to see some sunlight, get a bite before the next panel, that sort of thing. Any of my students who are writing a midterm paper related to any? Oh, hey, Javen, how are you?
I was really curious as to how you as curators think about land-use practices in relation to art, especially how that art is based out of a certain community or homeland. And how do you think about that? If they're, I don't know, back to the question of consent, if that art consented to being removed from that community, or for you, Sháńdíín, the leadings of the practices based on authority and peoples, and how has U.S. created about that exhibit being here in Rhode Island?
Mayaj, thank you for asking me that question. I think, Tess, you would also have a beautiful answer working with public art. I guess to answer maybe the later part of your question, we did a digital video for folks who wanted to see the show but couldn't actually make it here to Rhode Island. I did an article through Forge Project's journal Forging that people could read too about the process. We also tried our best to get folks to Dene folks and weavers specifically to actually come and correct our museum records. I think that's also behind the scenes stuff that won't get you public accolades, but is really, really important. And Costume and Textiles was awesome department to work with to kind of correct some of those records, because when we think about working with the archive, those corrections could help generations down to understand Dene weaving practices. I think also as Dene people, we think about what does it mean for the art to go out into the world. So I just tried best in that exhibition to really honor those most likely Dene women, but also could be queer Dene weavers who really were fantastic artists, even if in their Dene Bazad speaking reality didn't consider themselves artists, and kind of honor them and not see them through an ethnographic lens because of their Dene identity, but also honor their artistic compositional skills and their cultural knowledge. So while I'm arguing for us not to see all of these Native artists through an ethnographic lens, I'm also saying that they had extreme cultural knowledge that should not be discounted and sometimes is in the contemporary space. But I want to volley it to you.
Okay, absolutely. Working in public art is, I think, one of the hardest things to do. And in all honesty, was not something I ever really saw myself doing until I started doing it. And so my work with the Boston Public Art Triennial, my work with the Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum brings me a lot onto the landscape in specific places, working with specific communities. And so there's a lot of thought processing going into it when thinking about where we're engaging with the land, how we're engaging with the land, and what relationships we're building with the larger community that it's being placed in. And so it sometimes can be really tough. For example, when we were planning for the Boston Public Art Triennial, there was a piece that I wanted to place in one of the neighborhoods, kind of in the JP area, in one of the parks, and it was by a Native artist. It is by a Native artist, and the community pushed back because it was a largely Black community that didn't see themselves represented in the piece. And that was important, but I also want to highlight the fact that that area was where the largest population of Native people living in the city is. Not a lot of people know that, and clearly the community there doesn't know that. And so I worked with NACOB to get some kind of advice on it, the North American Indian Center of Boston, for those that don't know, on how to go about finding the right place for the work that both honored the artist, honored the place, honored the materials of the work itself and the content. And it has a beautiful spot that it's located now, but I will say, having thought about it afterwards, I wish I hadn't been, I wish I didn't been to that community, because the point of public art is to, one, make it free and accessible to all, and two, to speak about important subjects or ideas or thought processes in places that need that. And so this work could have done a lot of education for that community there about Native presence in Boston if it had been in that park. And I think would have been a really great learning opportunity to come together, especially thinking about my own Native community and the relationships we have with our sister tribes like the one down in Bermuda. And building relationships with those that maybe don't always have a connection to their home communities or other communities of color in the area. And so I think there was a lot that could have been learned on both sides. The other thing I'll say is that I work with artists, and my work right now, I have a show I'm planning with artists that are from New England. A show will be opening next kind of spring, summer, 2026, and it's public art on the landscape and within the landscape, and it is called The Land Tells Our Stories, and there's a reason for that, because so much of our relationship with art is also based in place and our own identities and telling the stories of those places, and uplifting that landscape, not just uplifting the artists in the community, but that physical landscape to have the same kind of weight as a name or as a material has. And so the people that I'm working with, one of them is Ella Mahoney from my own community, and she's working in a space that's not her homelands necessarily. It's the homelands of the Nipmuc Nation, and so she did a lot of talking with various community members in that tribe to see if this was okay, if it was, they were comfortable with her telling stories in this space that were from her community, but also very similar to those that are of the Nipmuc community, and they were like, absolutely, you're working within our homelands, but you are a cousin, you are a sister tribe to us. We have long-standing ties and relationships today, both that last, that are from millennia, been maintained. And so in this space, they were proud to have her telling those stories. And so she's doing a work in West Brookfield at Rock House, which has a history of occupation by Native peoples in the area, and she's telling the stories of our communities through contemporary ways, through contemporary practices, and maybe in a way that people don't necessarily think of as Native art. She's a contemporary artist working in silk, and that's not necessarily a traditional material, but she's telling traditional stories in new ways, and so she's sharing it both with the people, with the landscape, and with kind of, I think, future generations that will learn about that space. So there's a lot that goes into it, and like I feel like it was probably a disjointed answer, but when you're thinking about public art, it's kind of all over the place, quite literally, and there's a lot to be learned. I'm still learning.
So I'm gonna have us break for lunch, and if you do have questions, maybe you can chat with some of the folks before we all take a break. Apologies in advance for folks that we don't have refreshments here. There's something that the university is calling austerity that is being imposed upon us, even though we've had wonderful donations from major foundations, so you all should have lunch. But we will be providing you food at the later part of the afternoon after our second panel and performance. So at least we could get you that. There's lots of places nearby, happy to give recs, but our next panel back in this room will be at 2, and that is our fantastic artist panel, Weaving as Technology and Art Making as World Building, with Eric Paul Reach, Clementine Bordeaux, and Rachel Martin. So come back for that, and eat in the meantime. Bye. Thank you.